welcome to SNS. My name is Louise Lorentzon and I'm a research director here at SNS. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's seminar, which we are organizing together with the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. And I will shortly hand over to Jon Hassler, who will moderate this seminar. But first, let me warmly welcome our speakers. Diego Kensig, Assistant Professor at Northwestern University, who is joining us online, and Jytte Guteland, Member of the Swedish Parliament for the Social Democratic Party, and Katarina Lur, Climate Policy Spokesperson for the Green Party. With that, I will leave the floor to Jon.
Thank you very much. It's good to see so many people here and to see at least two of our panelists. Unfortunately, Diego couldn't come because of practical problems. He will say a few words about that. Nevertheless, I'm very glad that we have Diego online. Diego Kensig is an assistant professor at Northwestern in Chicago, or Evanston more precisely. And he is a macroeconomist that works on climate change, climate policy, and inequality related to climate change and climate policies. And I must say I'm very glad and hopeful that a person like Diego is doing this kind of research. Diego is a young and ambitious and very talented macroeconomist, and it gives me hope that persons like him is working on these issues. We old guys, macroeconomists, were very slow in going into this area. So it's good to see the young generation taking their responsibility. And we will start by having Diego give a short presentation of, I think, 18 minutes. And then we have some questions. And then we're going to bring up Katarina and Jytte to the stage. And it's also very good to have you here. You have been so important for climate policy, not only in Sweden, but in particular, I guess, for Jytte in EU. So it's going to be very good to hear what you have to say about these issues. Diego, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jon, for this very kind introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's a pity that I can't be in person in Stockholm today. I was really hoping to make it, but because of some visa issues, I couldn't travel at the moment. So that's why I'm still happy to be here, but only via Zoom, to talk about the macroeconomic impacts of climate policies. Climate change is one of the defining problems of our time, posing significant risks to our lives, livelihoods, but also the global economy. Now, in theory, we know how to address the problem. This is an externality, so we have to internalize the cost of polluting by putting a price on carbon emissions. However, this has proved to be very hard to achieve, especially at the global level, because of the pervasive coordination problems involved. And we have seen this over and over again at the COP meetings, where we have still achieved rather limited progress so far. More has been achieved at the national level, with an increasing number of jurisdictions having implemented carbon pricing policies, either in the form of carbon taxes or carbon markets. And here you can see a graphical illustration of this. This is from the World Bank Carbon Pricing Dashboard, which is a fantastic resource. And you can see that as of 2025, over 100 instruments have been implemented either in national or subnational jurisdictions. This brings me to the research questions of this talk. There are three questions that we're going to address today. The first one is, are these national carbon pricing policies effective at reducing emissions? Second, what are the macroeconomic effects of these policies? And third, how do they affect different segments of the population? So what are the distributional consequences of these policies? And the traditional approach to answer these questions is through the lens of so-called computable general equilibrium models. So what are these? This sounds whimsical enough. These are essentially models that underlie some assumptions on the behavior of households, on the behavior of firms, and the functioning of markets. And then within these models, we simulate certain policies and assess their impacts on the environment and the economy. So what do these models say to the three questions that we're going to talk about today? For the first one, these models typically predict that yes, national policies, carbon pricing policies can be successful at reducing emissions if carbon leakage is prevented to a significant extent. So carbon leakage, that's the issue that if you impose a carbon regulation at the national level, some of the economic activity may shift to other jurisdictions where regulation is laxer. The models also predict that these emission reductions can be achieved at relatively moderate macroeconomic costs, and relatedly also the distributional impacts tend to be negligible. Now obviously these answers will depend on the assumptions you make underlying these models. So a legitimate question is, with over 20 years worth of practical experience with carbon pricing policies, what does the data say about these three questions? And today we're going to focus on the EU ETS, which is the largest carbon market in the world. This is based on some of my own work. I should also say Sweden is one of the pioneers in carbon pricing, right? You introduced the national carbon tax in the early 90s. Today we're going to focus on the EU ETS, which Sweden is also part of. But there are also interesting studies that have looked at the Swedish carbon tax as well, and they find actually pretty similar results to what I'm presenting today for the European carbon market. Estimating the impact of carbon pricing policies on the economy is challenging. And this is because carbon prices, they are not set in a vacuum. Policymakers may respond to economic developments when deciding on climate policies. So if we were just to naively look at what happens to the economy after a given change in the carbon price, we may not be able to isolate the causal effect of a carbon price on the economy, because the change in the price may have itself been a reaction to economic developments. And this issue is even more acute in the carbon market because cap and trade prices, they're actually market prices. They're determined by demand and supply at any given point in time. And this is illustrated in this chart here. So here you can see the evolution of the carbon price in the European carbon market over the first three phases that I study in this paper. And we can see that there was quite a bit of variation in this price. But as I said, this is a market price, so it's driven by demand and supply. Fortunately, there are some institutional features that still allow for credible identification of carbon price impacts. And the idea is the following. The EU ETS is a carbon market, so this regulates the quantity. And to ensure that the emissions fall over time, this quantity is reduced over time. At the same time, these allowances are traded in the market, establishing a market price for carbon. And there also exist liquid futures markets where these allowances are traded. The EU ETS also wasn't established overnight. The regulations in this market actually changed considerably over time. And it's exactly these two observations that motivate my identification design. And the idea is to isolate the impact of carbon policy news by looking at how carbon prices change in a relatively narrow window around policy events concerning the supply or allocation of carbon allowances. So for those who are not that familiar with this market, let me give you a little bit more institutional details. So this European carbon market, it was established in 2005. It covers around 40% of overall EU greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a cap and trade system, so there is an overall cap on emissions covered by the market. And to ensure that emissions fall over time, this cap is reduced each year. Emission allowances, short EUAs, they're allocated within the cap, and there are different means of doing so. In particular, during the first years of the system, most of these allowances were actually allocated for free. I guess this was just a politically feasible way to get this market off the ground. But later on, auctioning became the default way of allocating these allowances. So firms had basically to buy these allowances on these auctions. At the end of every year, the companies covered by this market must surrender sufficient emission allowances to cover their yearly emissions. And this is enforced with heavy fines, so compliance in this market tends to be very high. The allowances are traded also on secondary markets. So if a company actually manages to reduce their emissions by more, and it has spare allowances, it can actually sell these allowances at a profit, or it can also keep them for future use. In the next step, I collected a comprehensive list of regulatory update events. These can take the form of decisions of the European Commission, votes of the European Parliament, or judgments of European courts. And of key interest in this paper are regulatory news concerning the supply or allocation of these emission allowances. So in the first years, the countries covered by this market had to submit national allocation plans to the Commission. Sometimes there were disagreements and even legal challenges. So these are all events that I'm going to exploit. Later on, auctioning became the default way of allocating these allowances. So there are lots of events concerning the timing and the quantities to be auctioned off. So going through the official journal of the European Union and the European Commission's Climate News Archive, I identified 114 relevant events over the period from 2005 to 2019. And this visualizes basically these carbon policy surprises. So this is the change in the carbon price expressed relative to wholesale electricity prices around these carbon policy events. And you can see that some of these events had pretty meaningful impact on carbon prices. So they moved carbon prices relative to wholesale electricity prices by over 1% in some instances. A key event happened in 2013 when the European Parliament voted against the backloading proposal. So just to give a bit of context, after the global financial crisis, emissions in Europe fell by a lot because there was the fall in economic activity. But this was not reflected in the way the caps were set in this carbon market. So over time, an oversupply of emission allowances emerged, and the Commission wanted to address this by backloading, by postponing the auctioning of new allowances. But in the first instance, the Parliament voted against this, and it was for similar concerns that we also observe today. They were worried that higher carbon prices may harm a still recovering European economy that was still fragile after the crisis. Only later on, the Parliament agreed on a modified version, which paved the way for higher carbon prices in the market, as we also observe them today. The idea then is to use this as an instrument to estimate the effects of a carbon policy-induced energy price shock. And here you can see what comes out. So these are the aggregates, the macroeconomic effects of a carbon policy shock, tightening the carbon policy regime, normalized to increase energy prices by 1% on impact. And we can see that policy works. So if you have a tighter carbon pricing regime, this leads to an increase in energy prices. And as a consequence, emissions fall because it has become now more costly to pollute. So this is the good news. But then if you look at the second row, this is maybe the less good news. So there are also economic consequences associated with this policy, right? So overall consumer prices also tend to increase, and output measured here by real GDP tends to fall. Right? The emissions intensity still improves. So basically emissions fall by more than GDP, but still GDP, the fall is non-negligible. So this is relatively costly. We can also use this evidence to back out a key statistics for policymakers, which is called the marginal abatement costs. So this is the cost that it takes to abate 1 additional ton of carbon emissions. And a back of the envelope calculation based on the estimates I just chose gives a marginal abatement costs of slightly more than 100 euros per ton of CO2. This is quite a bit higher than engineering estimates or the average ETS price over the sample. And the key difference is that my approach also incorporates indirect general equilibrium effects that occur via prices, consumption, and employment. So there are higher economy-wide costs of decarbonization than just the first round firm level impacts. And it's important to account for these if we do cost-benefit analysis, and I will come back to that. I promised you also to talk a bit about the distributional effects. So in the next step, we study how carbon price shocks affect different households. And the approach we will use is to measure changes in living standards after these policy changes by tracking how these shocks move key parts of household budgets. In particular, how they change the prices people pay, how they change the income they earn, and how they affect the value of their savings and possibly the transfers from the government they receive. And we will combine all these channels to get a simple money metric measure of a welfare loss. And this is what you can see in this chart. So positive numbers here are welfare losses expressed in terms of 3-year consumption. And we can see here that tighter carbon policy regimes, so higher energy prices, they lead to welfare losses across groups. The losses are most pronounced for low-income households. That's because of 2 reasons. First, they tend to have higher energy expenditure shares, so they're just directly more affected by higher energy costs. But at the same time, they also tend to experience larger income losses. So you can see here, these losses are really concentrated among lower income and also younger households. On the other hand, especially if you look at the different age groups, older households, they tend to be more shielded. And that's mainly because they rely mostly on pensions as their main source of income. So they're shielded from these indirect effects via the income, which actually turns out to be really important. We also look at some regional heterogeneity here, and we can see that especially Southern and Eastern European countries, they're most affected, but we find non-negligible welfare losses throughout, at least in the short term. So these are short-term economic costs. Now I also want to end with a bit of a longer run perspective, because a key motivation for these policies is that they may stimulate innovation in green technologies, which will allow us to sustain these emission reductions without permanently lowering output. So this is a key motivation also for the European Commission behind this policy. And here we test whether this also holds up in the data. And fortunately, it turns out to be the case. So here we look at green patents as a measure for green innovation. And we can see that there is an uptick in green patenting after an increase in carbon prices. There is, however, another challenge in the longer term, and this is one that's very topical, sadly, because we have seen this over and over again, right? That carbon pricing policies, they may lose public support and may be abandoned eventually. And we have seen this, for instance, in France with the Yellow Vest movement, or more recently with the Canadian carbon tax, national carbon tax, which was effectively scrapped. So what's the reason for this? This is from a nice paper by Conrad and Mangiante, and they basically look at how these EU ETS prices affect the extremist vote share and the Eurosceptic vote share. And you can see here that there is an increase in both of these. And this speaks to this concern that it's challenging to manage the transition without losing public support. Let's revisit the research questions that we set out to today. So based on the experience with the EU ETS, we have seen that, yes, national carbon pricing policies can be effective at reducing emissions. And indeed, the EU ETS led to substantial reductions in emissions. But this comes at a considerable short-term economic cost. And these costs are also unequally distributed, with poor households suffering the most. Let me end with some policy implications. So I think it's really important to take these economic and distributional effects seriously. And targeted transfer or recycling the revenues to offset the regressivity, I think, can go a long way. And because energy demand tends to be inelastic, in particular for these households that are most affected, this redistribution may also need to offset the emission reductions to a significant extent that we want to achieve with these policies. Now, even without these compensating measures, actually, it may still be optimal to decarbonize despite these non-negligible short-term economic costs. And this is because recent estimates of the social costs of carbon and domestic cost of carbon point to potentially much higher cost than previously thought. So this is based on some recent work with Adrian Bilal, who is at Stanford, where we exploit variation in global average temperature, and we find pretty sizable macroeconomic costs of climate change. And according to our calculations, the domestic cost of carbon for big economic blocks, such as the US or Europe, is around 200 euros per ton of CO2. So that's still considerably larger than the marginal abatement cost that I estimate. So based on this, it would still be optimal to decarbonize even with current technology. Still, if we want this to succeed, right, maintaining public support is really important. So that's why I think it's crucial to communicate the benefits of the policy well. So perhaps we focus too much on carbon taxes and too little on carbon revenues, because there are revenues that can be used for productive purposes. And just to mention one case in point, in Switzerland, which is where I'm from, a big concern are rising health insurance premium. So what the government did was to introduce a rebate from the carbon tax to this health insurance premium, and you can see it every month on your statement. So I think this makes it already pretty salient. Maybe we can even learn more from politics across the pond. So here, I mean, President Trump is the master of selling policies. So maybe we should mail out carbon revenue checks to make it even more salient. And this could help even further foster public support for these policies and ensure that we can organize a transition that is both equitable and successful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Diego. It was 18 minutes sharp, so I guess it's your Swiss background that plays out here, but we like that in Sweden. So you mentioned Trump, and I cannot resist actually asking a little bit of a personal question, but you don't have to answer if you feel uncomfortable. But this is about another climate, the Trump climate. If you talk to your colleagues, has it already become difficult to do climate research, you think, for social scientists in the US?
Fortunately not. I mean, within at least Northwestern University, I still feel very shielded. So I do have academic freedom, and there is also still interest, a lot of interest from the students, from alumni. So I gave an alumni event couple of weeks back. So this is I think this is great. But what's become a bit more challenging is obviously getting funding for climate-related research, because this was a big hit. Like the NHS, they have now different priorities, and climate change is no longer one of them, it seems.
Okay, that's good to hear at least. So you mentioned also back of the envelope calculations, and I like back of the envelope calculations, and in particular because sometimes they can give you a feeling for kind of, orders of magnitude. Is this big or small?
Yes.
So let me try a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation on you here. So EU emits something like 2.5 billion tons of CO2 each year. And last week, actually, it was decided that the climate law requires us to reduce that to around 500 million tons by 2040. So we have to shave off like 2 billion tons of CO2. You said that they cost around 100 euros per ton. Do you think it's a fair estimate to say that multiplying these things, 2 billion tons by 100, that's 200 billion euros. So a little bit less than 1% of GDP. Is that what it costs to reach this target?
Great. Yeah, no, I'm glad that we share the enthusiasm for back of the envelope calculations. I would be a bit cautious though, because I mean, the problem is, right, and I think I explained this, how do we estimate these effects of carbon prices on the economy? So in fact, what I exploit are changes around the rule, right? So these are unexpected changes in carbon prices, and they're not negligible, but they're also not of the order that you just described, right? So I think we can't just linearly extrapolate. There may be some non-linearities that kick in, and this is where maybe structural modeling that can complement this empirical analysis can come in handy. So you basically use a structural model to discipline with this evidence that I showed, and then use that model to extrapolate. So I think that would be, I mean, I think as a first to gauge, I think I like the back of the envelope calculation, but the structural exercise that I mentioned, I would trust more.
Okay, thank you very much. We have maybe some questions from the floor. So wait for a microphone and then state, I know some of you, but not, I'm going to treat everyone the same. So you have to state your name, and there is a question.
My name is Magnus, and I have a question about how carbon tax increases cost and decreases income.
So how exactly that happens? Yes, excellent. So I didn't have that much time to explain, but basically the way it works is that, okay, this leads to an increase in the costs of producing energy, right? But then power producers, they don't simply eat this cost, they will pass some of these costs on to their customers, right? So energy prices will increase for everyone. And then there is a first round effect, right? Because energy demand is inelastic, at least in the short term, right? So this reduces your discretionary income for other spending, because you have to heat your home, you have to power your facility. But then this is not where it stops, right? And important are the second round effect, because there is this reduction in discretionary income, this leaves fewer resources for other consumption, so you consume less, and this reduces demand for other products. And maybe in these other sectors, they feel this reduction in demand, and therefore they may lay off some people or reduce the hours worked, and so on and so forth. So in this way, this propagates through the economy. And this is one of the key contributions of my work, that I can get a comprehensive estimate, including all these second round effects, whereas a lot of the previous studies, they controlled basically for these second round effects. So they netted these out, so they would just have the first round effects. And if you just do that, you would find much smaller impacts.
Can I do a little bit of a follow-up on that? Because this also means that these effects depend on how the policy is formulated, right? Whether it's a tax or an emission trading, or whether firms or households are compensated, and things like that, right? Because exactly. I think you get results on that too. Isn't that true?
That's right. So we have some work on that, and there is a big debate on whether we should do cap and trade or carbon taxes, and I think both have pros and cons. I think one pro of the carbon tax is that the price doesn't change as much, right? So maybe it gets updated every other year, but firms can plan with that price, whereas like in the carbon market, and we have seen this also recently, there is quite a bit of volatility, and this creates uncertainty, and this may also explain part of the effects that are embedded in my estimate, right? And another one is, as you said, how you use the carbon revenues. So there is also some evidence, because there are differences. I mean, unfortunately, within the European carbon markets, you can't exploit any of these differences. But if you look at carbon taxes, there are differences in countries how they treat the revenues, and there is at least some suggestive evidence that points to the fact that if you redistribute these revenues, you can cushion some of these economic impacts.
The question there.
Thanks, Rob Watt from the government offices. You talked about innovation and the rise in patents. What is the long-run economic benefit of this rise in innovation? And how do you optimize the design of the policy on cap and trade to drive this sort of innovation? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, no, I think the innovation result is also what gives me some hope, right? So this also relates to some of Jan's previous work on directed technical change, right? So hopefully in the longer term, this will lead to the green innovations that we need to sustain these emission reductions, right? Because the problem is in the short run, we have our given technologies and we can't just like replace the technology right away. So that's why in the short term, it's really costly to reduce emissions. But then in the longer term, maybe we get more efficient machines. We get more competitive renewable energy sources. So we can achieve this at a much lower cost or even at a profit, right? The innovation effects that I document, they're non-negligible, but they're not huge, right? So I think we may want to complement this. So there is some interesting work that studies the optimal policy mix, right? So I think there are other policies that one could think about, in particular innovation subsidies, and perhaps you want to combine the two, right? The carbon tax and innovation subsidies. And for the carbon tax, because it's so costly, maybe you want to phase the carbon tax in slowly and at the beginning focus more on the innovation subsidies. So that could be one approach to cushion the economic effects and ensure that we can sustain these emission reductions also in the long run.
Okay, one question there.
Thank you. Thanks for a nice talk. My name is Per Strömberg, professor of finance at the SSC, Stockholm School of Economics. So it relates to the previous question, actually. In the model, am I right in thinking that you're actually not really accounting for innovation or changes in the way you do business in response to carbon prices that may actually decrease the amount of greenhouse gases at a lower, let's say, cost to growth and consumption? Is that correct?
In the empirical estimates, they will still incorporate basically what happened in this historical sample, and there seems to be an uptick in green innovation. But that doesn't mean that, like in the future, again, this is a historical analysis, right? And we can only extrapolate from this. It could well be that in the future the innovation effects may be stronger, and then this would look different.
Because I think that it might, some of these industry, if it's just about like saving energy because energy costs go up, some sectors can do that pretty quickly. But other big emitting industries might have to change technology completely, and which I guess one would guess takes 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And those parts, that latter thing wouldn't be in your estimates, right?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's just 20 years worth of data. I mean, some of it may be there, but definitely not to the full extent. So there is two forces. So you could think, okay, maybe could be even more costly because these hard to decarbonize sectors haven't really started. But on the other hand, you could have more innovation going forward as well. So it could become cheaper at the same time as well. So.
Okay, let's invite Katarina and Jytte to the stage. So Diego, you talked about, was it 114 policy events? Some of them are Jytte moments, right?
Yes.
Because you managed to get these deals in the parliament. So it's good to see that they also enter into this academic literature.
I noticed on this timeline that I was actually elected 2014, so that backloading debate was still very much, it was my introduction to the European Parliament. And I'm glad that we finally managed to take the decision. It was important for the whole ETS and the price mechanism started to function. Would you like us to start or just comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Extremely important to get the knowledge of how it works, and also especially interesting to look upon the ETS. I think for me, being a politician working on the ETS, I find that it is the most potent tool that we got actually to reduce the emissions, and I believe that without it we would be lost. So for me, even though we need to get into this important task of how the distribution function and different income group is affected, it's very important. But that said, I truly believe that ETS is the best way of tackling the climate change, and I truly believe that it is the best tool that politicians has created, and I would like to defend it until I die. So this is how much I believe in the system. I think we need to work much more on just transition and how to make sure that we redistribute what is collected and make sure that it goes to society, back to society, both for the reasoning that we learned here today, that we really need not to have a situation where households is not able to consume or use the economy. It has really that impact if you look upon if your wallet is getting smaller because of the energy prices, then you will not maybe buy that service, or you will do something else less, and that will impact, of course, the risk of unemployment and a situation that we do not want. But that said, if we work wisely on this, I believe we can create something that's quite different, both by being more active and proactive when it comes to redistribute from the state, both using tax, of course, and that tools that we have to make sure that those groups in society that is less have less welfare, they need a better situation today. I think it's obvious for everyone now that we have created a very unequal system, and that is a reason why we have populism. That is a reason why we have radical right politicians being very aggressive. So we need to do that better. But we also need to understand what's been said about the investments. If we do not invest in the new green technology, we will be left behind and we will lose jobs because of that. And we really need to take that into the calculation, because what we see now, and I think I will, that will be my first conclusion here, and then Katarina will be able to give your conclusions. I would like to say that when I think about the car industry, this is a vision for me. And when I look on the American cars, I see a decade a while ago. Could anyone fill in what years I think about when I think about American cars? Yes, 50s. Always someone who sees that. It's the 50s. They have been very successful. It's a cultural picture, but it's not the future. And then if we look at the Asian car industry, what do we see? Is it back or forward? It's the future. Yeah. Now about the Swedish and the European car industry, where would we want them to be? Back there, or in competition with China and the cars? That's the future. For me, it's obvious. There is no political answer to this. That we are not going to decide this. It is what is happening. Either we have industries that will be able to create jobs for the future, or we will be back there nostalgic together with the American car industry. And that is what this is about.
Yeah. Thank you, Jytte. Katarina, I'm going to throw in a question to you here too. So of course, we live in democracies. We have to get the support of people for this transition. How much of the problems that we see, and Diego pointed to some of them, do you think really has to do with money? And how much is that you know, the climate transition gets hijacked for other interests. I mean, you have been working a lot with real people, real voters.
Yes, I believe maybe 40-60, that 40% is a real problem, 60% is not, but you shouldn't forget about the 40%, because these are people that are actually affected by this in their daily life, and that's really important. And I agree with Jytte in many things that you say, as usual, but I think for us, I'm a member of the Green Party, and we saw during our regeringstid, when we were part of the government, we could see that people were affected, people were worried, and it was very easy for people that wanted to get people aroused that these things were really important for them. So I believe that this is an important thing, and when we now try to see how should we, if we have the chance to get in power again, get the emissions down fast, we know that we need to use the economy, because that's the most effective way. I mean, since we had the carbon tax in 1998, studies have shown that about 30% of the reductions we had was just caused by the carbon tax. And I think the ETS system has been really, really important also to reduce the emissions. But we believe that instead of subsidizing the fossil fuels that are done now, that you actually pay to reduce the use of fossil fuels. You have to move those money so people can use it either in the way that they choose, if they want to use it to get diesel or gas, they can do that, but they can choose instead of being like prisoned into the fossil fuel system. So for example, for farmers, right now they have this subsidize for fossil fuels in their working machines. We think that you should take that away, but take that money to give to the farmers so they can choose. Do they still want to use it to pay for the diesel? Or do they want to use it to save and change that way? And the same thing, now we have this new ETS2 system that will come. We know it will get more expensive with gas for private people. And we know that we have to help the people that really are in need of their car, and maybe people that has harder to get an electric car. So we have like a puzzle of things to help people to either choose another car, to lease an electric car at a very cheap price, but also that we would like to have like a national trading system above the ETS2, where we will have money in and then give that out to people that lives in this, maybe not in the suburbs, but på landsbygden. So people that really are in need of the car or have very little money will also get money, and as much money that they can actually use it for something. Because what we see now with bonus, you get the check if you have very little money, so you can have that to get an electric car. But it's so little, and it's for the people that have very low income. So it will probably be used very little because they will not have the money to buy the electric car anyway. So we have to really calibrate that system so that the lowest income household will not be the one that will be punished. But I think that will, as Diego said, also had to be combined with things like subsidizing refurbishments. I mean, you have to help people with everything that will be more expensive, but focus on the low-income households.
Yeah, a Swedish emission trading system sounds like a good idea. I mean, I had it in my investigation, but the government didn't listen to me. Hope they listen to you. So going back to my back of the envelope calculation. So, I mean, you had some caveats, Diego, but nevertheless, let's take it as that's a benchmark. 1% of GDP in losses of going to minus 90%. Is that something we should be worried about? Anyone? 1%, is that a lot?
Of course, it's a lot. I mean, we also know at this moment that people are really pressed. We have a really tough situation in Sweden, in Europe, and in the world. It is very turbulent, and we see now also people scared, of course, of what will happen to the world economy. But to talk about that 1%, we need to do a combination here where we understand that doing nothing is also costing us that in a longer run, and we will lose investments. So we will definitely have both Swedish companies losing what they have already invested, but also in the future, those investments that has not yet been done will also be lost if we don't act. So I would not say that it is quite that bad, but I do see a big need, and my party sees a very big need for having redistribution in the economy, where those with lower incomes, even in the middle class that has also a tough situation at the moment, we need to make sure that the budget is helping people to invest in the future, in the electric car, but also in transport that is more friendly to climate, and also investing, of course, in equality, because we have had a situation in Sweden where we have also lost where we came from. We were a country that invested in equality and in security for the people, and that made us brave to believe in new jobs. We were not defending the old economy, the old jobs in the last in the 150 years that we had the industrialization. That's why we have so successful companies in Sweden. We need to learn from our history, and we cannot be afraid now of a transition that will happen anyway. So of course there is, you should say, an investment cost also for the public society, and that is also very well described here, how it happens. But we need to understand that if we don't do that investment, we will lose instead. And that is much more turbulent for Sweden that has been so successful with our companies. So yes and no. It will have an impact, but it will not be that bad, and it is better for the security of the future.
I mean, maybe it's difficult for a politician to say that 1% is little, but for a macroeconomist, it's not. I would say it's not that much.
I see the quotes.
No, but I would just like to add very, very short that if you see the situation today, when suddenly the price on oil is going up and the stock market is going down, and we don't really know what is going to happen to the Swedish economy based on that we're actually stuck to the fossil fuel system. I mean, if we could invest and just take a step back from that, we could be much more independent, and maybe this investment would actually be money back to Sweden just because of this investment. So I think investments should lead to something good in the future, and I think for health issues, for safety and everything, but maybe it's a good economic choice anyway.
So we have time for some questions. Anyone? Yeah, there in the back.
Thanks, Peter Holmgren. I just wanted to flip the discussion a little bit and ask you a question that we're all on the same side here. We see what we need to do in terms of the climate, so that's not the point here. But my point is that you're representing certain parties, and I would like to flip the question and say that, okay, let's believe in ETS, let's believe in market-based solutions. That means that we will want to have lots of investments, lots of profits, lots of making money out of climate change. And that is what's going to pull us out of this ditch. So I would like to hear your perspective on the role of capitalism in getting us away from climate change. Thank you.
Should I start?
If you want, yeah, please.
Yeah, I do believe that we need big companies and smaller ones for that matter, that is big polluters today and also those who might not have that role, but they have important technology for the future. Of course, we need them to invest in the new economy. So there is a huge role for that capitalism. But that said, it will not happen if the politicians are not very clear about the targets and also have not flip-flopping on the different directives and where we will stop. The transports are one example. I mean, we need to be clear that it is not the future for the fossil fuel-based engines. We need to also be brave and say that we don't see that we can sell those after certain dates. I do believe that the politics needs to play that role, because if we don't, I don't see that one company would like to go ahead and take the risk for others. That is not how the market works. So it is, and that's what I'm trying to say about Sweden, that we had been very successful in having that economy where the state plays an important role, but where we also believe in our companies. So we have had that blandekonomi in a very successful way, and should continue with that and understand that this is not unmodern, it's the opposite. We are having a very modern way of leading that we need to go back to and understand that will help others also today. So yes, a very big and strong role, and maybe stronger now than when I was in the European Parliament, because then we needed the regulation and we needed the directives. But now I think it's also the time for the investments. And one last thing around that is also that maybe we need to be more clear about what Katarina told about how much subsidies that goes to the fossil fuels economy, and how many stranded assets people are afraid will be there if we are too tough in the politics. And that is actually the big reason why people hesitate. It is not, in the big public debate, I believe, it is not the fear of the inequality. It is the fear of losing investments in fossil fuels. That's why we are pushed in the politics. Then, for me, it is about equality, and I believe many of you believe it's important. But I believe when we come to why it is so strong, this demands against us, I do not believe it's the people. It is the investors that have invested wrong.
If we go to the capitalist kingdom of the US, how do you view it there, Diego? Are things going, are the emission path going to turn up again, or what's going to happen, you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, because obviously in the US, it's been a turbulent history of climate policy these past decades, right? So we went from the attempt from introducing cap and trade legislation in the late 2000s, early 2010s, to sort of a more regulation-based approach, and then reversals under Trump 1, and then more a subsidy investment-based approach under Biden, and now other rollbacks under the second Trump presidency. But what makes me optimistic is if you look at renewables in particular, right? So the price of solar, the price of wind, these have come down so much that they're now basically the most competitive technologies. So even though some of these IRA, Inflation Reduction Act provisions, have been repealed, in Texas there is this trend of expanding renewables that will be hard to stop, right? Because it's just now the most competitive technology. There is obviously a confounding factor, because now there is this AI revolution, and to power it you need a lot of energy, right? So So I think without that, emissions would keep coming down, but with that, I'm worried that actually we may see a reversal of that trend, at least in the short term, because right now we just don't have the capacities to power all this with renewable sources. These capacities have to be built, and that takes time.
Katarina, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I agree with both of you very much, and I think there are some things that are important. For example, I mean, I agree with the mixed economy. I think that serves us well, and I think that a lot of companies will also be able to make a lot of money on the green transition. And I think one of the big problems is actually the oil and fossil fuel industry that is holding back and trying to stop this process, because there are a lot of places where renewables are much cheaper right now than fossil fuels, and then politicians are pushed to go in and subsidize. But I think even if you would be totally against a capitalist system, then I think we are in such a hurry to do this transition, so we don't have time to change that system. We have to work within the system to be able to do that as quickly as it needs. So, but I agree, and I'm not.
There was a question here, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Diego, you mentioned early on that the effectiveness of a cap and trade system depends in part on there being some way of handling carbon leakage. A border carbon adjustment mechanism of some sort that makes it both effective economically and effective in terms of emission reductions. My question is the European border carbon adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, is it designed effectively to deliver those things? Should it be extended, made tougher? How can it be optimized?
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I think at least we're going into the right direction, right? Because these competitiveness concerns, they're legitimate, even though, I mean, I think in the past, yeah, I mentioned these free allowances, so some industries also made a profit out of that and maybe overstated leakage concerns, but leakage is an issue, especially at the prices that we see now. I also have some research on leakage where we already document in the earlier phases some leakage effects to Africa, from Europe to Africa. So I do think it's important to take it seriously and have something like the CBAM to prevent that. And now we're actually in an environment where we can do it because the WTO sadly maybe became less relevant, but now Europe has also more freedom to design the carbon border adjustment mechanism in a way that serves Europe.
My name is Katarina Ringborg. I have a question to Diego. Earlier, you mentioned that you did not, to a great extent, include innovations and development into your calculations for the future. My question is, did you lean on any empirical estimates or any other type of research or experience?
Excellent. No, that's a great question. So, I mean, these estimates, they will incorporate the effect that I've shown on the green patenting. So that's basically, that will be incorporated in the estimates that I've shown. My point was that maybe these estimates, they're not necessarily representative for the future, right? So actually, I stopped in 2019, right? And now, since then, the European Green Deal and lots of things have happened. So maybe if a few more years pass, I can update these analysis on a longer or on a more recent sample, and it would be fascinating to see whether maybe some of these effects have already changed. But to do that, what you're suggesting, you would have to do maybe a more model-based analysis, and then you can simulate different scenarios under different assumptions, what happens to green innovation. And yeah, that's something I haven't worked on personally, but John and others have studied things like that.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, thank you. My name is John Erkmats, and I'm head of sustainability at SEB Asset Management. You said that we as investors have invested wrong, and that, I mean, I kind of see the roles of politicians a bit different. But you talk a lot about investments, both of you or all of you. What can you do as politicians to create better market conditions or more investable products or easier access for our savers to gain access to this and be able to invest in this in a way that actually supports the real transition. Allowing private capital or private investments haven't maybe not been all of your party's strongest suit, or where you stand on the barricade before, but how can this be created so that our savers can access this?
First of all, I do believe, and I believe also my party believes, that capital is needed, and we need risk capital to invest in good businesses that have the technology and the innovation for the future. And that will not be possible to do for the state, or we will not have muscles enough. So it will be needed. That said, I think we need to, and my party believes that we need to be more predictable in the political system. It is now a turbulent situation, even though I do not believe that European climate law will be reopened in a way that will not benefit those who invest in the green technology. People might think that, and that is bad enough, that idea that it might be completely changed, or that some of the directives will change. That insecurity is enough for some to hesitate. And if one hesitates, another one might hesitate, and then the market will start to work in a more fragile way, or less resolute for the green transition. So I think that is it. We need to fight less and be more predictable in the political parties, and be able to show that this is happening. And then I must conclude by saying I don't think it is me and Katarina actually who is the big problems in that sense at this moment. But that said, they are not here to defend themselves.
We are running out of time, but a final comment from Katarina.
Yes, I would just say that predictability and sharp climate targets, so everyone knows where we're going. But I think also public procurement is one of the important things that if all different, that we have to say that, okay, we don't want the fossil fuel infrastructure, we want something else. We can pay a little bit more to get the good things, and I think also to put demands on what is okay or not. And we have, for example, Exportkreditnämnden, which I'm not sure about what it's called in English, but I mean, they shouldn't invest in fossil infrastructure, not in Sweden, not anywhere else too. So I think to show like a very clear line where we're going and what we don't want and what we really want to invest in, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Jytte and Katarina, for an interesting and illuminating discussion, and so much also to Diego. Thank you very much for coming in this way to the seminar. I think it worked pretty well, I must say. Unfortunately, we cannot invite you to the mingle that starts afterwards here, but that's a price you have to pay. Thank you, Diego. Thank you, Jytte and Katarina.
Thank you.